Jay Gould and his colleague Niles Eldridge, who came up with the second idea. Well, there was others, but those were the two most prominent. The second idea was called punctuated equilibria. What a name. But essentially what it means is that evolution doesn't seem to have happened gradually, because what happened was that Gould and Eldridge noted that what we actually see in the fossil record was stasis. So they agreed with us. We've been saying all along, we see the same organisms. They don't change through time. There's a stasis there, and Gould did half of our work by agreeing with us that, look, what we see is stasis, but then he also predicted in punctuated equilibria that what happens is evolution happens quickly. So there'll be a long time period where an organism does not change, and then all of a sudden it will change into a different species, usually connected with some kind of a geographic isolation that allowed it to change through time. But we're happy to agree with Gould on one hand that we don't see evolution through the fossil record. Things tend to stay the same. And then we're also happy to agree with Darwin that the gradual changes of the fossil record, but those changes are only microscopic and not changes that demonstrate one type of organism evolving into the other. Now, creationists are split on this issue of the age of the Earth. There are what you call the Yaks, which I'm a member of, and Jeremy is a member of. Nice to see you, Jeremy. Young Earth creationists, okay? And then there are many very solid Bible-believing, well, at least they say they're Bible-believing, Christians who maintain that the Earth is old. Now, my own personal opinion, to be honest, I can respect someone who thinks the Earth is old, but I would argue in my own brain, well, have they read God's Word? Have they really read God's Word? Because, look, it doesn't come out and say flat out exactly how old the Earth is, but there's so much evidence biblically, and I'm not going to bog down in that, but I'll just name a few of the arguments that strongly suggest that those are literal days. The word yom, in the context of Genesis, you have ordinals, day 1, day 2, day 3. This is characteristic of literal days. Also, the term morning and evening during the first 6 days denotes a literal time period. And I really honestly believe that the Lord allowed those terms to be put in there so that no one could say, oh, well, you see, the word yom can mean a long period of time. Right, in a certain context it can. Like the day of our Lord, or it was, the days of Babe Ruth when he was hitting home runs. You could see where it could be a long period of time. But you would also use a different Hebrew word, probably olam instead of yom, if you were denoting long periods of time. The best argument biblically, and I'm going to stop here with arguments for young age biblically. If you're interested in that, by the way, look at the writings of Ken Ham. He's done an excellent job on that, of denoting the days as literal 24 hours. And before him, one of my main mentors, Dr. Henry Morris, also wrote extensively on literal days. So those two gentlemen is who I would refer you to if you're interested in looking up some of the arguments biblically. My final biblical argument comes from Exodus, where God wrote with his own hand that he created in 6 days, resting on the 7th. You say, well, maybe those were long periods of time, like Hugh Ross says. He has not done his homework. He either hasn't done his homework or he refuses to listen to these arguments because he has heard all of these arguments many times and refuses. His exegesis of those early chapters of Genesis is tortured, in my opinion. If you look in Exodus, though, let me finish and then I want to mention one other brief thing. If you look in Exodus, God writes with his own hand that he created in 6 days, resting on the 7th. Then you might raise your hand and say, well, how do we know he means literal days? Maybe those were long periods of time, like it says, 2 Peter, a day with the Lord is 1,000, or 1,000 is a day. How do you know each one of those days weren't long periods of time? Well, first of all, if they were 1,000, that only makes 7 years. So that argument is poor. Not only that, you're out of context. It's not talking about creation in that context. It's talking about God's patience. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the days of creation. But now, here's the interesting thing about those verses in Exodus where God creates with his own hand in 6 days, resting on the seventh. And that is, he uses that model. You've all read this. Remember, he uses that as a model for the work week. Well, if those are millions of years for each one of the days, you're not hardly resting on the seventh day. And so it just makes no sense whatsoever. I believe Hugh Ross gets that wrong, and he gets a number of other things wrong. Why? Because he has not read Scripture and looked thoroughly at it. Because just my opinion, you know, and maybe I'm wrong, but I've been a Christian for 40 years and I've read it intently and studied it. I really believe that those are literal days, and there's no reason that I can see, and I've read all of his literature, that I need to take those as long periods of time. But his reasoning is kind of the following. Okay, but on the seventh day, you see, you yak, on the seventh day, young earth creationists, on the seventh day, you see, God, it doesn't say that God rested. I'm sorry, it doesn't say that the evening and morning, it says God rested. Okay, the seventh day, it says he rested, but it doesn't say that as on the other days, and it doesn't say evening and morning. Therefore, he's still resting, and we are therefore still in the seventh day. Aha! See? Mr. Yak, doesn't that show that the days could be long periods of time? No, it does not, because it says he rested, not he is resting. Okay? See the difference? It's past tense. And it was only in the context that he was no longer creating, not that he was, I'm exhausted. I've been creating for all these days, all these millions of years, and so I got to lay down and take a nap. I'm tired. God, we know in Hebrews it says God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He doesn't need to sleep. He doesn't get tired. He doesn't run out of energy. So that's not the context. So I believe very strongly the Bible suggests, I haven't even mentioned the genealogies, okay? I could go off on a tangent on that, but then we would never get to carbon 14, which is our talk for tonight. Clearly, the Bible teaches a young earth. Okay, and you say, well, what theologian teaches that? You know, I know so-and-so that teaches that it's old. Okay, well, someone I highly respect, someone who has, in just my opinion, I could be wrong, but just my opinion, one of the greatest Bible teachers of this or any other generation, Dr. John MacArthur. I hope that most of you know who that is. If you don't, I highly recommend you listen to him on the radio. He's on the radio every day. And you may disagree with him on other doctrinal issues. I'm not trying to get into all that, but he is strongly committed to those literal days. And so I believe it is possible for us to argue that those days are young. Biblically, our exegesis is confirmed very solidly with many, many scriptures that the Bible does teach that the earth is young. And so I get a little mystified with people like William Lane Craig. I want to raise my hand and say, have you really studied the scriptures? Yes, you're an excellent philosopher. Yes, you're excellent for arguing the case for Christianity. But have you really read the scriptures? Because I believe the Bible clearly, for anyone that's honest, teaches that the earth is more than likely very young. The Bible doesn't say it's young, but it certainly implies it very, very strongly from the scripture. And I have to say that if it turns out the earth is old, okay, I can live with that, but I would also really question, well, but am I totally misinterpreting scripture, the hundreds of verses that suggest that it's young? So there's that case. And then what is so exciting, the evolutionists love to hit us over the head. Oh, you creationists and you Bible believers, you've got to be wrong because the earth and the universe is old. Most recent estimates, the earth is 4.6 billion years old, and the universe is thought to be at least 13 billion. Now that number has been revised over and over. So has the age of the earth been revised over and over. So here's what's really interesting. If you ask an evolutionist, what is that age based on? And they'll say, oh, it's based on solid scientific evidence. We have a wealth of knowledge that demonstrates that the earth is old. And if you say, well, I disagree, there's, lots of geochronometers that show a young earth, they will look at you as though you're insane. How dare you ever say that this could be wrong? Well, I want to point out something to start that you'll find really fascinating. Here I have a book. You see it's really old, okay? This book was republished, I think this is like the second edition, was 1960, written by a very famous paleontologist that none of you have ever heard of, with the exception of Jeremy, will know the name, Edwin Colbert, okay? And Edwin Colbert, who's since passed on, was a very famous dinosaur paleontologist, vertebrate paleontologist, and wrote many, many books during the course of his academic career. But he says something very interesting in his book called the Dinosaur Book, as I mentioned, last published 1960. I don't know if there were more updated versions of this, but here's what he says on page 36. 1960 now. He says, the Earth is about 2 billion years old. Well, modern evolutionists would say it's more than double that now. But here's the interesting part, what the rest that he has to say. This is not a mere guess, but is the result of careful, ooh, that's interesting, careful cumulative studies by many investigators working over a long period of years and along various lines of evidence. Of particular use are the investigations of radioactive materials in rocks of ancient age. Boy, doesn't that get you thinking. So now he said, look, we know, 1960, that the Earth is 2 billion years old. This isn't a guess. It's based on careful radiometric studies. So what would be your first question? I know mine would be, excuse me, Dr. Colbert, I'm curious, the radiometric dating techniques, they're giving you that age clearly of 2 billion years old? He would have to say, absolutely. We've done careful studies, gone into the lab. The radiometric dating techniques show that the Earth is 2 billion years old. Really? Well, I come from the future, and it's 2016, and I'm curious, are you aware that today, the same radiometric dating techniques that are so advanced and so precise say that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old? I think we might have a little problem here. Now, that's just the tip of the iceberg, folks. This last summer, I spent my entire summer based on an article that was written by Dr. Andrew Snelling, and I'm going to walk over here for just a minute and get this. I highly recommend, if you're interested after tonight's talk, a summary fashion of tonight's talk. I was inspired by an article written in this book, which is called How Do We Know the Bible is True? And in that book, there is a paper here by Dr. Andrew Snelling. Here it's listed right up here. Dr. Andrew Snelling, Radiocarbon Dating, How We Know the Bible is True. And the article codified and brought together many, many years of research, thoroughly referenced anyone that would like to come up here and see this. Most of my information, with some exceptions, is where I started. When I read that article, I said, wow, this is so amazingly complete and complex. We don't need to look at any other evidence. If we look at the carbon-14 dating, radiometric carbon is what some people say, but truly it's carbon-14. There are other forms of carbon. When we look at that evidence that you're going to see tonight, it's very exciting because what the evidence overwhelmingly not just suggests, but tells us that the case for a young Earth less than 10,000 years ago is stupendous, it's spectacular, and it's overwhelming. Now, you, the audience, will be my critics tonight. If I don't make my case, please raise your hand. I'm going to take that chance because I'm that certain that the evidence is overwhelming. I want you to, at the end of the talk, whether you're a creationist or an evolutionist or whoever you are, that's fine. Be honest, though. Look at the evidence tonight and see if I make my case. If I don't make my case, raise your hand at the end of the talk and please let me know. I'm sorry, Professor Phillips, I am not convinced, and I know that the old Earth is a fact. Okay, that's what I want you to say to me. If you thought that the Earth was young already, and I've strengthened your faith in that regard, please raise your hand and let me know, because I did hundreds of hours of research in order to get to tonight's talk. to be able to present it to you, and I believe the case is overwhelming. So let's proceed. Enough of the verbiage. Okay, next slide, please. Now, before we do anything, let's build a background. I apologize to those of you that have been in the creation evolutionist movement for a long time. You're very familiar with these terms. Okay, well, I'm just going to briefly go through the two models very quickly, and then center that in on the age of the Earth, particularly carbon-14. So, first, the evolutionary model. It starts out with the concept of uniformitarianism. That is, the present is the key to the past. Evolution argues that slow, gradual processes, the processes we see operating today, stream bed erosion, slow, gradual deposition of sediments, that this is the norm and that we can explain all of the geologic column without ever inferring the idea of catastrophism. Now, there's been a little bit of an update to that, so I have to give some evolutionists credit. There's a term called actualism that has gotten into the literature recently. Some evolutionists are acknowledging believes in catastrophism anymore in the sense of a worldwide New Awakened flood. So now we can go ahead and use that word, and those nasty creationists don't have a foothold anymore, and so it's okay, finally, for us to use that word. Wrong. You're starting to get back to the reality, the truth now, that catastrophism does have some merit to it, and we do see catastrophes. I'll talk more about that in the creation model. Fact number 2 is the fact of evolution. Bill Nye, last year I came and spoke to you about some of the problems with Bill Nye and what he has to say. And Bill Nye brought it up in his book and also in the debate with Ken Ham. You might remember when he talked about evolution, and Ken Ham nailed him on the point that, look, microevolution is not the same thing as macroevolution. Look, nobody disputes the minor variational differences in butterflies or dogs or cats. But that's not what we're talking about. Macroevolution is the concept of molecules to men through time. Problem. As a paleontologist, I have to say it's not the subject of our talk, but we do not find the intermediate forms in the fossil record. They're systematically missing. That is to say, between amphibians and reptiles, between reptiles and mammals, between ape men and humans, we do not find those intermediates. The missing links are still missing. So macroevolution is not an established extension of microevolution, but in the evolutionary model it is. They look at microevolutionary changes between peppered moss and they say, see, we see evolution in action. We see the variational changes through time, and then they simply infer that as an extrapolation to go from dinosaurs to men. When in reality, we see those micro-variational changes, but they do not and have not led to the kinds of molecules to men changes that must have taken place. Why? Because we don't find those intermediate forms in the fossil record. And the third point within the evolution model, the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. This is said to be an absolute fact. If you dispute that, or if you say that's not true, then they consider you mentally disturbed. Okay? And there are some evolutionists who think creationists should literally be sent to jail. People like Richard Dawkins and others. There were signs when Answers in Genesis opened up. You can go on their website and find this to be the case. They were outside picketing, saying that if you teach your child creation, that is child abuse. Okay, I'm not making that up. That's hard to believe, but it's true. I promise you. Go on the Answers in Genesis website. You will see videos when they first opened. They tried, the evolutionists tried to prevent the opening of the ark. How many of you guys know about the ark? Okay, it's been open since July 7th. My understanding, I'm here in California, so I haven't been there, but my understanding from the newsletters unbelievable response for a life-size ark. And boy, I know I would love to get out there and see that. Incredible response. But they tried to stop the building of that. Why would they bother, or why would they care? Aren't we just these lunatic, fringe, creationists, you know, Christians that don't know anything anyways? Well, they don't even want us allowed to present our worldview. And that is the truth, and that is what is happening in scientific circles. If you don't think that's the case, I highly advise you get a book. You can write this down, I'll say it slowly. Slaughter of the Dissidents. Okay, now I know Jeremy's read it and knows all about it, but anyone interested in the documentation by Jerry Bergman's Slaughter of the Dissidents, there's a part 1 and a part 2. There's been many that have said, frankly, I don't believe in evolution. I think creation is a better model. And whether PhD or whether going up for tenure, they lose their tenure, they lose their jobs. It's happened over and over again because, as they said to Mark Armitage, I know he's been down here to speak for your group, as they said to Mark Armitage when he wrote an article on soft tissue and dinosaur, the guy stormed into his office and said, "We don't want your religion at our school," Cal State Northridge. Mark said, "I didn't say anything about religion. I presented a paper in a scientific journal and never mentioned anything about creation, religion, the Lord, the Bible, none of it." But it was a conclusion that this individual felt very uncomfortable with, because how do you get soft tissue surviving 65 million years? Very difficult to explain. And so he saw that as an attack, and somebody presenting their religious views against his religious view, which was atheism, humanism, and evolutionism. Okay, next slide, please. So that's the creation model. Now, that's the evolution model. The creation model starts out with catastrophism. Catastrophism, the notion, if you go to Genesis chapter 7, it talks about the world that then was being overflowed by water. And some people like to say, Hugh Ross again, that, oh, this was only universal in the sense of all man being wiped out. Wrong. There is an abundance of verses. Every high mountain under heaven was covered 15 cubits up. Okay, we know a cubit is at least 18 inches. It could be more than that. There's additional cubits. So the flood, we're talking about a flood that was almost 30 feet above the highest mountains. How do you get a local flood that covers the highest mountains in one area but doesn't flow over the other areas? You know, was there some kind of a wall built that was high enough to hold it in? Oh, I don't think so. There's many verses that strongly suggest the flood was universal. It lasted a year. The fact that Noah had to take such a long time to build an ark. If it was a local flood, why didn't Noah just move to the next county? He would have been safe. Okay, he had to take all of the land, air-breathing creatures in that ark. If you're not sure how that's possible, I highly recommend a book, John Woodmorappy. What a name, and please don't ask me how to spell that. But you can get that book at Answers in Genesis or ICR.org, either one of those. John Woodmorappy is called The Feasibility of the Ark. Feasibility of the Ark. And tremendous studies where he demonstrated clearly with the technology then, so almost 5,000 years ago, how you could house, maintain the animals that needed to be on there. Don't forget, none of the ocean organisms would have had to be taken. Okay, so no fish or organisms that live in the ocean had to be on the ark. Only the air-breathing land animals. And it was the kinds, not a species. So we're talking a much larger taxonomic group, probably at the family level, which would be 2 orders up, okay, from the species level. The Bible never, ever uses the word species, only the term kind, which is a larger taxonomic group. So the dog kind, the cattle kind, and so forth, like that, okay? So the creation model, catastrophism, there was a global worldwide flood that deposited most, I say most, of the sediments worldwide that we call the geologic column, so that those sediments were deposited rapidly, catastrophically. Those were not different ages, those were locations, probably geographic, differently. So you say, well, why aren't men and dinosaurs found in the fossil record together? There is some circumstantial evidence that they are found together. However, I'm not going to talk about that tonight. I will mention, though, that probably they lived in different geographical locations for the most part. It's the same reason why a whale doesn't fly through here and just eat us all or kill us all. How's that possible? They exist here on planet Earth at the same time. Okay? Well, he's actually a marine biologist, so he'll intimidate me if I keep talking about marine biology. But that doesn't happen, does it? And yet we live here at the same time, and there's a creature that certainly is big enough to kill us. It doesn't happen because we're in different geographical or ecological locations. Okay? The creation model implies, even though there are some old Earth creationists, but it does imply a young Earth only thousands of years. Creation ex nihilo is what the Bible teaches. If you don't think that, write this down if you don't think that. Psalm 33:6. God spoke the universe into existence. He didn't use a method of evolution. It clearly suggests in Psalm 33:6, God is so powerful, he doesn't have to create things step by step. He's so powerful, he spoke and things came into existence. By his word, the universe was created, not by some evolutionary process gradually through time. The Bible teaches that in Psalm 33:6. So that then animals and plants of the past were contemporaries. We didn't have these many of different geological ages, the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian. Those time periods probably didn't exist. They were probably, more than likely, in my opinion, geographical locations at the same time. Deposited, for the most part, there are other catastrophes in Earth history, but deposited for the most part during the one-year worldwide Noachian flood. And that's what carbon-14 tends to argue for. That's what I'm going to present now. Next slide. Now, the way that radiocarbon, or carbon-14, actually works, there are numerous different kinds of carbon. Okay, I should say numerous, but there's a number of different kinds. There's carbon-12, carbon-13, and carbon-14. And I'll be explaining what those isotopes, or different forms of the same element, carbon, actually are about. Radiocarbon forms essentially in our upper atmosphere. I will explain the process by which that happens, but we have to start somewhere. And radiocarbon circulates in our atmosphere and then gets into our biosphere. The way that that happens, as I'll be explaining, is through the photosynthetic process. Animals eat the plants, we eat the plants and the animals, so every organism takes in carbon, particularly radioactive or unstable carbon, and then when you die, you stop taking that in, and that begins to change into nitrogen-14, which is measurable. So you can measure that and see how old something actually is from today, how many years ago it actually lived. That's the general process. Now let's start to get into a little more specific. Next slide, please. Okay, now I mentioned there are at least 3 different kinds of isotopes. Okay? What we see right here, carbon-12 is the main one. Where does that name come from? It comes from the fact that if you look at the atomic structure of carbon, in the center, which is the nucleus, you have 6 neutrons and 6 protons. That, added together, gets carbon-12. Then there's also the second carbon isotope, which is carbon-13. Notice that the vast majority of carbon is carbon-12, 98.9%. Most carbon is not carbon-14. It's either carbon-12 or some of it is carbon-13. But a very tiny fraction of all the carbon that does exist, whether it's in the atmosphere or the biosphere, exists in the form of carbon-14. So it turns out the overall quantity of carbon is 0.0001. A tiny fraction of the total amount of carbon is radiocarbon, or carbon that changes through time. So that's what they mean by radiocarbon. So you know how people take a Geiger counter and it ticks. The number of clicks that it ticks allow you to measure the amount of a particular radioactive element. So you have radioactive elements such as uranium or argon or potassium. These are all different radioactive elements. That means they change through time. They're unstable, and I'm not going to explain why because that's too technical, but just know that they change through time into other elements. Eventually uranium changes into lead, Okay, potassium changes into argon and so forth. But we're focusing right now on the element carbon. So carbon-12 is stable, as you see in the chart. Carbon-13 is stable. They don't change through time. Carbon-12 stays carbon-12. Carbon-13 stays carbon-13. But radioactive, this is important that you get this now. Radioactive carbon-14 changes through time into nitrogen-14. And that rate of change is measurable, and that's how we can date once living organisms. The change from carbon-14 to nitrogen-14 through time can directly be measured. We have a very sophisticated instrument to measure that with. I'll be talking about that in just a minute. Notice that the nucleus of carbon-14 is different than the nucleus of carbon-12 or carbon-13. The name 14 comes from 8 neutrons and 6 protons, so it is a little bit different. It is an isotope or a form of carbon, but nonetheless a radioactive form. Only carbon-14 is radioactive. Carbon-12, carbon-13 are not radioactive. They are stable. Carbon-14 changes with time. And I'm sorry to bombard you with all these technical terms, but we have to do that so we get to the point that you understand, if you're new to understanding how carbon-14 works, you get to the point that I want to make at the end, which I'll say it now. Carbon-14 argues very strongly. I don't know how you get out of it. I've racked my brain for months now to try to figure out, well, what's wrong with my arguments. I'll admit my bias, but I can't come up with any arguments against my arguments, and that is that carbon-14 absolutely, when we date things with carbon-14, shows that they're very young. That is an Earth that is probably less than 10,000 years old. Direct scientific evidence. Now that's one thing the evolutionists are always accusing us. You know, you creationists, your view is just based on faith. Wrong. I can show someone, if they don't want to listen, that's their fault, but the hard evidence dramatically shows from carbon-14 that the Earth is quite young. So let's take a look at some of that evidence. Next slide, please. Now, a little bit more before we move on to the direct evidence. What can be dated by radiocarbon? Only certain things can be dated. Because what we are actually dating is the carbon in once living systems. So we never can date rocks unless they have organic substances in them, like some limestone has shells, marine shells in it. That can be dated. But normally, you never date rocks, only organic substances. Now, when we say organic, I'm not talking about like at the grocery store where you go there and, oh, it's organic, it has no pesticides. That is not the term that we're using or what it means in science. In science, it means something that was once alive. Okay? It doesn't have anything to do with pesticides. Something that was once alive. And normally rocks don't contain carbon unless there's a few exceptions, like coal is an exception. Limestone is an exception if it has limestone fossiliferous shells in it. Okay, so only organic, once living substances is how we are using the word organic. Examples would be wood, bone, shells, tissue, you know, soft tissue even. We've got plenty of that in dinosaurs. Coal, and coal comes from dead plant material that's been compressed. And here's the one that's really interesting. Carbon-14 has dated numerous dinosaur bones. That's right, we have dated dinosaur bones from carbon-14. I will show tonight, I'll give examples, I'll give you a website you can go to look this up yourself to see if I'm not one of these crazy creationists. When we date dinosaur bones, they always are young. Now wait a minute, you say, but I thought dinosaurs lived 65 million years ago during the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous time periods. I've been studying dinosaurs for many years, as has Jeremy. We are convinced that dinosaurs have lived in recent times. For example, very quickly, the book of Job, Job 40 and 41, many of you are familiar with it. It seems to really absolutely be talking about two dinosaurs, Behemoth and Leviathan. And then someone will raise their hand and say, well, I read that. It doesn't even use the word dinosaur once. What do you mean? Well, are you aware that the term dinosaur was not coined until 1842 by Sir Richard Owen? when the Bible was written, and we know Job was one of the earliest books, maybe 4,000 years ago, right after the time of the flood, of course Job didn't use the term dinosaur. It wasn't even invented. But that doesn't mean he couldn't describe dinosaurs. And this is what's so exciting. We are going to see some precise examples tonight, different kinds of dating materials that all come back very strongly with a very young age. That's not possible if the Earth is as old as the evolutionists say it is. Okay, next slide. Now, we have to go through, I apologize, but we have to go through, and I'll be brief on this so that you don't fall asleep, but I have to go through the process of how carbon-14 is created. As I mentioned, the vast majority of carbon is not radioactive or unstable through time. But the way that happens, the sun, as a result of the solar wind, blasts out materials, and it blasts it out at about 800,000 miles per hour. Unbelievable. The sun is probably the most violent place in the entire universe. Stars are. You could not get within 1,000,000 miles of the sun. My students like to say, well, Mr. Phillips, what if I just ran up and just touched it real quick? I say, you don't understand. You can't get within 1,000,000 miles of the sun. It's as though thousands of nuclear bombs are going off constantly on the surface of the sun. You've got solar flares that shoot out 1,000,000 miles. You'd be fried before you even got within 1,000,000 miles of the sun. But the sun shoots out cosmic rays, electromagnetic rays, as you might know that term, and many of these cannot be seen by our eyes. We see visible light, but that is a tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum. And you've got things like ultraviolet rays, radio waves, and X-rays that shoot out of the sun at high intensity and bombard the Earth. If it wasn't for Earth's magnetic field, we would all be destroyed instantly. We were talking about that tonight at dinner. You know, is there a reversal, and how fast does the Earth's magnetic field reverse? We argued that it has to be rather quickly because everything would be destroyed. So the Earth's magnetic field protects us from these cosmic rays, but some still get through. They come into our upper atmosphere, which is essentially composed of nitrogen, 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen. They interact with those nitrogen atoms in the upper atmosphere, and they create a very small percentage of the carbon is, as a result, radioactive carbon. Now, from that point, photosynthesis occurs. You'll probably remember what that is from your textbooks back when you were in college. And this is, photo means light, synthesis means to put together. You know that plants, actually, I don't know how else to describe them, and someone might disagree with me on this, but I call them antennae, okay? These antennae actually take in the radiant energy of the sun and convert that to chemical energy. We call it chlorophyll, that's why plants are green. And that is a form of food. That is their food. They actually convert radiant energy into chemical energy. That's how plants get their food. That plant material, which contains radioactive carbon, is then eaten by the animals. We eat the plants and the animals, so every living thing takes in carbon-14 till the time of our death, and then you no longer take in the carbon-14, so now it's a measurable rate, and that, the clock begins ticking, and the carbon-14, which is radioactive or unstable, begins to change into nitrogen-14. Okay? Now, that is at a known, measurable rate, and I'll talk about that rate in just a minute. So we can actually take anything that was once alive, and we can carbon-14 date it, and we can get reasonably accurate dates. And therefore, we can know and tell how long ago something died. Next slide. Now, let me summarize this because I don't want to put you all to sleep, and I know this is rather technical. I'm sorry about that. There's no other way around it. But let me summarize. Radioactive or cosmic rays come into the atmosphere. They interact through the photosynthetic process with plants, take those in, and then animals eat the plants and the other animals that eat the plants. Eventually, the herbivores are eaten by the carnivores, and we eat the plants and the animals, and therefore every living thing takes in radioactive carbon. At the time of your death, you no longer take in carbon-14, nor do any other once living organism, and it begins to change to nitrogen 14. It changes at a known measurable rate, and I'll show you how they measure this in just a minute. This is very crucial that you get this. The half-life, or the time of change, takes for half of the amount, or the ratio, of carbon-14 to nitrogen-14 is 5 scientists in the world. Nobody disputes that amount, evolutionists or creationists. The rate of decay, the half-life, half of the time it takes for carbon-14 to change into nitrogen-14 is 5,730 years. So, in another 5,730 years, half of that carbon that's left will then be changed into nitrogen. So now, in 2 half-lives, 2 times 5,730 years, 11,000 some odd years, 3/4 of all the carbon, that 14 that was in that once living thing, will now be converted to nitrogen-14. So all we have to do is measure that organism, and we can tell instantaneously through the certain instrument I'm going to talk about in just a minute that the amount of carbon has been changed into nitrogen, and therefore we can know exactly how old that organism was and when it lived. Okay, very sophisticated process. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, the rate of radiocarbon decay. The nuclei of the carbon-14 are unstable. That's what carbon-14 is about. Now, I've been speaking on creation for well over 30 years, okay, all my adult life pretty much. The number one question I get as I do seminars or as I speak in presentations, I always get the number one question: what about carbon-14? So finally it got to be where it bugged me so much I had to work up a talk specifically on this. The nuclei of carbon-14 are unstable or radioactive, and these change over time into nitrogen-14 with a measurable rate. Notice I'm repeating a lot of things I'm saying because it's very important that you get those points so that at the end this all comes together when you ask the question, what does it mean? And I will tie it in and tell you exactly what it means. So a neutron breaks down to a proton and an electron. The electron is then ejected, and this is one kind of radioactive decay. There are other kinds, but this is called a beta decay. So obviously, well, thinking about it, there must be an alpha decay. You're right, there is an alpha kind of decay, but we won't talk about that tonight. So there's just different kinds of radioactive decay, all that's saying. Next slide. Too good on a cloudy day or at night, but nonetheless, they tend to keep accurate time. Well, radiocarbon decay is very much like that. You were able to precisely date once living organisms to find out exactly when they lived. Now, or accelerator mass spectrometer, we'll show some of these methods and how they actually measure that amount, is approaching the limit. When it gets up to 90,000, we can no longer discern any carbon-14 atoms. So that's about the limit. 90, 100,000 years if you really want to stretch it. Beyond that, the carbon-14 method can't date anything. So you essentially would come back with a carbon date of 0. There's no carbon remaining after about 100,000 years. And certainly after only 1,000,000 years, if all the atoms make up the entire Earth were radiocarbon, then no carbon-14 would be left. That's a crucial point, because carbon decays at a known rate, half-life of 5,730 years, so then you get less and less and less through time. After about 100,000 years, and certainly I'm stretching it another tenfold time, 1,000,000 years, no carbon should remain. Okay, now that's a crucial point. Why? Because anything that's older than 1,000,000 years, I should find 0 carbon in it. Our most sophisticated, wait till you see this machine, our most sophisticated ways of measuring it should find 0 carbon. Because the half-life now, we've gone through many, many half-lives, the amount of carbon is so minuscule we can no longer measure it. So dinosaur bones, based on this method, we should predict. We should find no carbon, within reason, no carbon in dinosaur bones. Why? Because the last dinosaur should have died off, according to evolution, 65 million years before present. And therefore, any organism that has lived in the distant past, according to evolution, the old Earth method, should not reflect any carbon-14. That's a reasonable prediction. I think everyone would have to agree, whether creationist or evolutionist. Anything that is older than 1,000,000 years, probably only older than 100,000, but certainly older than 1,000,000, should have no carbon-14 left in it because too many half-lives have gone by, and therefore it should be immeasurable. Is that what we find? Do I have to pack up now, get ready to leave, and duck my head in shame? Because when we've taken these dinosaur bones into the lab, they give us, you know, that exact measurement? Well, no. I can stay, because when we put bones into the sophisticated instruments that measure the bones, what they come back are quantities of carbon-14 in the bones. What? But didn't dinosaurs die off 65 million years ago? How's that possible, Professor Phillips? It's not possible. That's the answer. Why? Because the Earth is young. It is not 4.6 billion years old. It's not even 10,000 years old. It's young. Okay, next slide, please. Let's start to get into some of these evidences after I show this slide. But this just shows you the exponential decay law. Over here is the percent of radiocarbon. So after only one half-life, okay, 5,730 years, I would have a small quantity of carbon left in. After only 2 half-lives, I have only 1/4 carbon left, 3 half-lives, so forth. As I approach 100,000 years, look how low the amount of carbon-14 is left. Certainly by 1,000,000 years, there's been so many half-lives, there should be no measurable carbon in any once-living organism, by its bones, shells, or whatever, its teeth, should not have measurable carbon in it if the Earth is old. And anyone that, within reason, has to agree with that. Now, you might wonder already, I'll answer it for you, how would evolutionists respond to this information? What would they say? Well, what they would say is, okay, well, maybe you've got a point, but look, we know, quote, we know that the Earth is old. Excuse me, how do you know it's old? Well, because evolution's a fact. But how do you know evolution's a fact? Well, because the Earth is old. Well, how do you know the Earth is old? Because evolution's a fact. Well, how do you know this and that? And it goes in a complete circle. It's an ideology, folks. You might think to yourself, well, but they're the scientists. They're these guys in these white lab coats that walk into the lab and do precise, unbiased work. Oh, really? Just like Hillary Clinton is unbiased. That's the kind of unbiased work that they do. Okay, and if somebody likes Hillary Clinton, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be offensive, but I would
Sure
think.
you do.
Okay, sure I do then. Let's go with it. Let's go with it. Okay, now, I hope you're getting the point. Carbon-14, when we take fossils into the lab and put them into these complex, sophisticated instruments, would certainly not reflect having carbon in them if they are billions of years old or millions of years old at all. Okay, next slide. Next slide, thank you. Okay, so modern radiocarbon detection technology. Let's start talking about how they get the carbon-14 measures. Accelerator mass spectrometer. The AMS, as it's called, or accelerator mass spectrometer, I won't repeat that term, hopefully. I'll just say AMS, but you'll refer back to it, okay, if you need to, is capable of detection on one radioactive carbon-14 atom in 100 quadrillion carbon-14 atoms. That's how sophisticated it is. This is equivalent to detecting one unique sand grain along a beach that's 100 miles long, covered by sand, okay? You can detect one sand grain. This is not, something that's unsophisticated, folks. This is a very sophisticated, precise instrument. And as I'll mention in a minute, we have ways of checking it to see if it's accurate. Every piece of, quote, ancient material, carbon tested, has contained measurable quantities of radiocarbon. That's worth repeating. That's an important point. Every specimen, I don't care what it is, whether it's dinosaurs or organisms from the Cambrian, 500 million years old, in every case, they detect discernible carbon-14. Okay, and it's not some result of contamination or something like that. I'll explain. There are ways that they can be very precise and careful to eliminate things like contamination. You say, well, maybe the instrument's measuring it, and it's a false measurement. No, and I'll explain why in just a minute. Every specimen has measurable quantities of 14. What is the implication? The implication that all of these organisms didn't die off millions or billions of years ago, but died in recent history. That's an amazing implication when you think about it. So for example, things like fossils, coal, oil, natural gas, limestone, so fossiliferous limestone, for example, marble, graphite, all having carbon or organic substances in them from different strata, all different layers, okay, so that they should register different quantities showing different time periods, or no carbon at all at least, have all contained measurable quantities of radiocarbon. Folks, that is impossible if the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. It cannot be. The carbon should have long ago half-lifed itself out and become nitrogen and be unmeasurable quantities. So carbon-14 is an amazing data that demonstrates a young Earth. Okay, let's move on. Next slide, please. Now, how does this accelerator mass spectrometer work? Look at this thing. You can see how big it is, how sophisticated it is. You have precision operators that it goes through this entire process. Accelerator mass spectrometer. I'm not going to explain the technique of how it works. Don't get, upset. You're saying, oh, man, I'm tired tonight. I don't want to go hear this technical stuff on how AMS works. Okay, I'll spare you. But just know that accelerator mass spectrometer is an ultra-sensitive method for analyzing these isotopes. Okay, it's very sophisticated. It's not something that's guessed at. It can measure these atoms at a very precise level, and we can check it to see if it's measuring them accurately. That's the point. Nobody disputes that, whether evolutionists or creationists. Next slide. Okay, modern laboratories measure radiocarbon with these sophisticated instruments called accelerator mass spectrometers. This is a much improved system over old methods where larger quantities of the specimen had to be burned. For example, the dispute with the shroud. Okay, and I'm not saying my opinion one way or the other on the shroud, but when they first were trying to decide whether the shroud actually was the burial cloth of Jesus, they would have to take a larger chunk, and so that was with the old method. With this, you take a very small piece, so that it doesn't destroy the specimen that you're trying to determine the date on it. The machine is able to count carbon-14 atoms, one atom at a time. It can detect one radioactive carbon-14 in 100 quadrillion regular carbon-12 atoms. That's how sophisticated it is. It can be checked specifically. This is very important in case you want to say, well, maybe it's just contamination, or maybe the instrument malfunctions when you put it in there. It can be checked for contamination by using what's called a blank sample. You simply take a holder specimen, which has been thoroughly cleaned and made sure that there's no carbon on it, and put it into the instrument, put it in what's called a blank holder in the AMS instrument, which should yield a 0 radiocarbon. So you check it to see if it's registering right before you use the instrument. That eliminates the possibility that somehow it's contamination and maybe somebody touched it with their hands or they sweated all over it and they got carbon on there. The guy's losing his hair, so he drops some hair follicles on it or something. Who knows? In any event, you don't have those issues because it will record a blank sample holder to see if there's anything on that card when it's put in there. Okay, so that eliminates that whole issue. Okay, next slide. Okay, hang in there. We're through most of the difficult part. Now we're going to start getting closer to the actual conclusions. Findings are consistent with a young Earth. That's very important. Older Earthers claim the results are somehow due to contamination. Look, we're not going to accept your data because we know that the Earth is old. AMS technology refutes this old Earth claim. It's a very sophisticated system. It's not something that's simplistic. Specimens are clean and they're treated with acids to make sure the contamination didn't get those specimens contaminated before they're put in there. And then once again, a blank sample will yield 0 before the specimen's even put in there to make sure the machine is recording things correctly. Okay, so they're very careful. Materials in the field are bagged, they wear gloves, they make sure they don't contaminate the specimens before they bring them in to the laboratory to be checked by the AMS. Next slide. Okay, now, a confirmation of young Earth based on fossils. I want to give 3 examples so that you know that this isn't just some red herring. Well, maybe you got one date, Professor Phillips, that showed, this dinosaur was young, but that was a red herring, and there was something wrong with the machine that day, and the truth is they're all 65 million years old. No, not at all. I want to give a bunch of different examples of things that have been dated using the AMS, and they come back with the conclusion that the materials are very young. And then at the end, I'll show you a test to confirm that the materials are very young. We get something that you would not get in the results if it was an old Earth. Fossil coal is demonstrated as being very young. Diamonds, you thought diamonds were a girl's best friend, but diamonds actually show a young Earth, believe it or not. And dinosaurs absolutely show a young Earth in 2 different ways. Now, some of you are familiar with J. Warner Wallace. Who's heard of him? Wrote that book called The Cold Case. Okay? Excellent writer. He is a forensic detective. And in his latest book, which is on evidence that supports that God exists, which is tremendous, I highly recommend you get it, he points out that if you have 2 different lines of collaborating evidence, that's much stronger of a case than if you only have one evidence. Carbon-14 in itself demonstrates that the Earth is young, but I have a very strong collaborating evidence, and that is soft tissue in dinosaurs. Ladies and gentlemen, we could not and would not have soft tissue, not only dinosaurs, but consistently in many, many other types of organisms in the fossil record, going back to what's called the Cambrian, which is more than 500 million years before present. We find soft tissue in many different kinds of organisms consistently. Dozens of organisms have been documented in the literature as having soft tissue in them. You've probably seen Mark Armitage. If you haven't, write that name down. I highly recommend go on YouTube and watch some of Mark's videos that are on there. Charlene?
He'll be here in 2 months.
Great. Come for his talk. I highly recommend that. He's a good friend. Mark has spent countless hours, and he does a little demonstration. He will take dinosaur tissue and take forceps to it and spread it apart and it'll spring back. My skin doesn't do that, which is supposedly 65 million years old. He can take forceps, spring it apart, and it springs back.
What's his name?
Mark H. Armitage, and he'll be here in 2 months. You have to come for that talk with all your questions, and he'll answer every one of them because he spent countless hours showing this. Even Mary Schweitzer, the evolutionist who's done the most work on soft tissue, likes the work that Mark has done. She doesn't agree with his conclusions, of course, that this demonstrates dinosaurs are young, but she does like the work that he's done showing soft tissue because it confirms her work. And Mary Schweitzer, who is a committed evolutionist, when she first found the first soft tissue in a T-Rex bone, conferred with her supervisor, who is Dr. Jack Horner. Many of you know him, but you didn't know that you knew him. He is the model for the character that Sam Neely, the main character in Jurassic Park, played. Dr. Horner was the model for that character. And he is a real paleontologist and runs a museum. Of course, he's a committed evolutionist and can't explain soft tissue in dinosaurs. Nobody can, unless you're a creationist, and that is, hey, that shows they're young. But you see my point here? This is collaborating evidence. Carbon-14 shows young specimens, and soft dinosaur tissue also argues for young specimens. Two independent lines of evidence that have nothing whatsoever to do with each other. Both argue strongly for a young Earth, and these specimens are young. Next slide. Now, let's look at the first example of some of this material I'm talking about. Here we see a histogram of coal. And this was analyzed by the RAPE people a number of years ago. ICR and Creation Research Society sponsored a joint effort where you had a large number of PhDs in particular fields that related to the idea of the age of the Earth. And the word RAPE is the acronym for radioisotopes and the age of the Earth. And these, or I should say radioactive age of the Earth. These coal analyses showed, no matter where they took the samples from, and no matter how old the coal was supposed to be, it showed measurable quantities of carbon in the coal. Okay, so now if you're thinking, the implication for that is that coal is probably less than 100,000 years old. It's probably less than 100,000 years old, and certainly it's less than 1,000,000 years old. But here's what's interesting. The coal was taken from different geological ages that were thought to be from 40 million to 350 million years old. You say, well, but 100,000 years, that's not the biblical age that you young Earth creationists say it should be. I'll talk about that in just a minute. But you see that 100,000 years, that utterly destroys evolution right then and there. If things are only 100,000 years, you don't have enough time to evolve organisms, therefore you're dead. You're done right then and there, okay? Whether I've proven the Earth is 6,000 to 10,000 years old or not, you are dead because evolution cannot occur in that short a time. Next slide. Now, what are the implications of the coal finds? Coal, you may or may not know, is buried vegetation almost entirely composed of carbon. There's two theories for how coal forms. Autochthonous and lochnathous, okay, which is kind of late to be using those technical terms. If that doesn't put you to sleep, I don't know what will. Either that, I'll put it in layman's terms, either coal formed in swamp beds, or as many creationists think, coal was washed in during the time of the worldwide New Awakened flood and deposited very quickly. Okay, so those are the two models. In either way, the coal was deposited in the sediments. Samples of pieces of coal from the U.S. coal beds, these were procured, ranging from Eocene, according to the evolutionary time period, to Pennsylvanian, ranging in alleged age from 40 million to 320 million years BP, before present. Now, all contain similar radiocarbon levels equivalent to ages between 48 and 50,000 years. That is very significant. Notice that no matter what age period they took them from, whether it was Eocene, which is 40 or 50 million years old, to Pennsylvanian, 320 million, very dramatically different in time. And yet all of them came back with these ages between 48 and 50,000. That is significant. I'll explain why in just a minute. Next slide. Okay, we're getting there. Hang in there. Hang in there. Now, here is an example of the chart of some of these materials. The column shows the co-locations in their conventional geologic age. The sample includes all three geological eras, okay, including the Cretaceous, Jurassic, and Triassic of the Mesozoic, which is the middle time period according to evolutionists. Notice that these come from different sample beds, different states, and more dramatically, look at the geological intervals, different time periods, Eocene, Cretaceous, Pennsylvanian. And guess what? They all contain, look in the very last column, carbon-14 to carbon, that's carbon-12 or carbon-13 ratio, and a percentage of modern carbon. We wouldn't expect those specimens to have 100% modern carbon rate. We would expect much of the carbon to have changed, only 5,730 years to change half of it into nitrogen-14. So in only a few half-lives, most of the carbon should not exist. But every single specimen had discernible amounts of carbon-14 in it. Folks, that's impossible. If these are the ages claimed by the evolutionists, you cannot explain the carbon that is in there. I've already eliminated the possibility of contamination. Why is there carbon still in there? The obvious answer, because the Earth is young. That's why. It's obvious. And it's very difficult to explain otherwise. You might have to, throw up your hands if you're an evolutionist or you're believing in an old Earth and say, well, we'll find the answer somewhere. Oh, really? Well, that's why I'm showing you different lines of evidence from different locations, different time periods, and different kinds of specimens. All of them come back with the same conclusion. The Earth is young. Next slide. Now, diamonds also confer a young Earth. These substances are known to be one of the hardest natural materials on Earth. They are very resistant to chemical alteration or contamination. Diamonds are one of the hardest substances that exists. They're so hard that you thought that, their utility is, well, they look beautiful on, a young lady's hand or something, and that might be true, but diamonds can actually be used as a drill bit because they're one of the hardest substances there is. And you can tell whether he got you a real diamond or a cubic zirconia. Just look at it in a magnifying glass. You see a bunch of scratches? That is not a real diamond. Diamonds are very difficult to scratch. That's why they're so valuable, besides the fact they look so wonderful. What they call in the street, the bling bling, right? Okay, so now, these diamonds are difficult to contaminate because where they're found is deep under the ground, and they're brought up through the volcanic eruptions by pipes or vents. When the magma comes up to the surface, it brings up these diamonds. Essentially, diamonds are carbon that has been crystallized. It's been formed under such great pressure from being deep under the earth there that the carbon is crystallized. So how do you contaminate that? Nobody has an answer for that I know of. How do you contaminate something that wasn't formed in the atmosphere? It wasn't formed on the surface. Animals certainly didn't interact with it, or plants. It formed deep under the ground. So how did it get contaminated? Because that's what you have to argue when I show you the results. Diamonds, thought to be billions of years old by the evolutionists, come out with an age of approximately 55,000 years, consistently close to the ages of coal. Well, that's interesting. So now we're getting two different types of specimens, two different lines of evidence, and they both come with the same approximate age. Diamonds cannot be contaminated in situ with recent carbon due to the fact that they form so deep under the ground. Nobody can think of ways to contaminate diamonds. That's one reason they were used for the rate study. Extremely hard to explain unless you come to the conclusion. Same conclusion we came with coal. Coal shows that the Earth is young. Diamonds argue very strongly and powerfully that the Earth is young. Next slide. Now, the RATE team analyzed 12 different diamond samples of carbon-14 content. These specimens came from different areas, such as West and South Africa. They're approximately 20.25 carats and weighing about 50 milligrams. So they're not the beautiful big rocks that we put on people's fingers. These are industrial diamonds. They're not even beautiful to look at. Okay, and the AMS analysis of these specimens requires that the diamonds be destroyed. How do they do that? They're crushed to small chips and burnt, converting them to CO2. This gas is then condensed to graphite, which then the AMS analyzed. So it's a pretty sophisticated method that they use to do that. And when they come back, they always come back containing carbon and showing a young age, never millions of years. Next slide. Okay, now, we quickly, you don't need to read this, but here's the different locations they come from. Here's the diamond location, and then you see the percentage of modern carbon that is found in them. We wouldn't expect 100% carbon because these specimens are, by our standards, old, but not millions of years. You think in terms of thousands of years for these. Okay? And the source comes from Don DeYoung, 2005. If anybody is interested in my sources, I can present those. It's rare that someone challenges me, but I believe thoroughly documenting what I have to say. And so I can provide those if anyone really wants to see the sources. Next slide. Hang in there, we're almost done. Diamond conclusion. Similar to the result for coal, all 12 diamond samples had detectable C14. The rate, or radioisotopes of the age of the Earth, research marked the first time C14 measurements had been taken on diamonds. The evolutionists never bothered to carbon date diamonds. Why? Because, well, everybody knows they're billions of years old. Quote, they're billions of years old, so they never bothered to take C14 samples. But when we did, the creationists, thinking like a creationist, doing good science, dated them, showed that they were young. The presence of C14 in, quote, old coal samples is a major conflict with long age time scale and confirms the young age. So independent lines of evidence from coal and from diamonds demonstrate young ages for these samples. Next slide. Okay, and my last example, and then we'll wrap up some conclusions. Fossil dinosaurs confirm a young Earth. What? That's anathema, Professor Phillips. That's impossible. Everybody knows from childhood. What's the first thing when you open up a dinosaur book that it says? Dinosaurs lived millions and millions of years ago. Okay, I have many, many books on dinosaurs, hundreds of them. Almost all of them start with that saying. So the one thing that we supposedly know is dinosaurs are millions of years old, right? Wrong. The best evidence is from C14, from soft tissue. We're finding more and more evidence. In fact, I'll predict we find even more, demonstrates that dinosaurs are young. Dinosaurs are thought by evolutionary standards to have lived from approximately 225 to 65 million years before present during the Mesozoic era, which includes the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods. Okay, that's where they got the name Jurassic Park. Okay, if this is true, then based on the half-life of 5,730 years, after only 1 million years, no C14 should be detectable in dinosaur bones, if evolution's true and the Earth is old. But what we find, and I will demonstrate and document, that many, many dinosaur bones have been C14 tested. Every dinosaur tested, dozens of specimens have been found with detectable carbon-14 in the bones. What? This is impossible if dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago. That's right. Okay, now, you might want to write this down. I'm going to give you a reference where you can go on the internet and check this out for yourself. Two things that you can look up. Go to, you can Google the term Paleochronology Group. Paleochronology Group. And their website, Paleochronology Group. Okay, their website is dinosaurc14ages.com. Let me repeat that. Dinosaurc14ages.com. When you go to that site, the Paleo Group, I happen to know there's 4 gentlemen, all scientists, and yes, they are all creationists. Joe Taylor, Jeremy, you know Joe Taylor, and he's one of the 4 gentlemen on there. What they have done is taken dinosaur specimens. Joe Taylor is famous for his digging. In fact, he's part of that museum down there in Texas that you went to. And they have dug up many dinosaur bones, confirmed as dinosaur bones. No one disagrees with that. But they've sent them to the University of Georgia, who has done carbon-14 dating on the dinosaur bones. And I don't know what the circumstance was. I doubt if they sent them to the lab and said, by the way, these are dinosaur bones, tell us what the age is. Because if they'd have done that, they would say, oh, we can't date these. Carbon-14 can't date something that's millions of years old. So they probably sent the bones in and didn't say what they were, and just, please date these, tell us what the age is. Next slide. What they came back with, and I've only have some of these listed on here, because then you would really fall asleep instead of the semi-falling asleep you're doing right now. And we see different specimens: Triceratops, Hadrosaurs, Allosaurus, Aracanthosaurs, all of them dated with this carbon-14 method, coming back with ages that should not and cannot exist if the Earth is old. Next slide. Okay, now, independent line of evidence. I mentioned this, and I'm not going to go into too much detail because Mark is far better knowledge on this than I am, and he'll give you the details, but I will wet your whistle a little bit. Independent line of evidence from soft tissue and dinosaurs also confirm a young Earth. So I don't have one argument from C14. I've got a collaborating argument from soft tissue. Soft tissue has been found in many dinosaur bones, and notice I said other types of specimens from ancient strata. Okay, ancient by anyone's way of thinking, but how old it actually is disputable. That should have long ago been destroyed. This soft tissue, how is that possible? We find things including proteins, such as collagen and hemoglobin, blood vessels, and possibly even red blood cells, as denoted by the evolutionist Dr. Mary Schweitzer. And when Mary Schweitzer first found the first T-Rex, the first thing that Jack Horner said, I think I mentioned this earlier, but he says, oh, the creationists are going to love you. She is not a creationist. She is an evolutionist who does not believe that the Earth is young, but she has admitted and acknowledged that she's found soft tissue in dinosaurs. And this is very hard to explain if you think the last dinosaur died off 65 million years ago. It isn't one dinosaur with soft tissue, it's many. In fact, almost all of the specimens coming back now, I will predict, and we've found many like that. There's lists of these. You can go on the ICR website and find, from the writings, for example, of Brian Thomas, there's lists of many different kinds of ancient organisms with soft tissue in them. Okay? How is that possible? And then Mark decided, and Mark is an electron microscopist, try saying that 5 times fast, and Mark runs his own electron microscope. He's a thoroughgoing biologist with many, many degrees, very good in science. I'll certainly support him in that. And Mark went and got his own Triceratops horn, dug it up himself, took it to the lab, and sure enough, he found soft tissue in that, and the soft tissue is very springy. How in the world can you explain soft tissue in something that's 65 million years old? That soft tissue is better than living people alive today than their soft tissue is. Next slide. Now, what are some of the conclusions? Evolutionists have responded to these findings by suggesting that there must be, because we know that, folks, that, quote, evolution is true, so we know that there must be a process involving something that must have preserved that for all that length of time. So they've recently suggested that it's iron and hydroxyl radicals that preserve that tissue. In other words, in your blood you have certain proteins, such as hemoglobin, that have iron in it, and that somehow must have preserved the specimen for 65 million years. Oh, please. Well, certain creationists, chemists, have looked at this. You can get this paper, the Creation Research Society. So if you want to write that down, if you really want to dig on this and see if I'm telling the truth, Creation Research Society Quarterly, which is put out quarterly per year. In 2015, these two chemists, whom I won't pronounce their names because I don't know the correct pronunciation, they've documented the many problems with the evolutionary experiment and refuted those conclusions. In fact, they've concluded that 2 years of study, which is what the evolutionists did, certainly cannot be extrapolated to the 68 million years that is suggested. You know, so that's like getting one drop of water and saying, oh, you know, we've created the Pacific Ocean. the extrapolation is just beyond credulity. And they are grasping for straws. They don't have an answer. How could this soft tissue be preserved? Morta sets in. Our bodies begin to eat themselves away. That's why, remember when Christ brought Lazarus out of the tomb, and they said, don't do that, Lord. They said it, of course, a little different than that. But they said, don't do that. He stinks horribly. Don't do that. If we open up that tomb, it'll smell so bad, it'll knock us out. You can't do that, Jesus. Okay? But not only did he bring him back from the life, but he's going to restore and regenerate all of the molecules that have long ago set into decay. When you die, your body eats itself up from the inside out. Okay, as gross as it sounds, bugs at different stages begin to decay that body. We can tell how long ago someone died. Forensics looks at that, and they can tell by the certain kinds of insects that are there, which show up at different times, how long the decaying process has occurred. You rot very, very quickly. So now the question becomes 65 million years, or in this case 68 million, how in the world, by any process that we know of, could you preserve that? Now, we know that that can't be true. How do we know that? I have an article from one of the recent journals, and this is excellent if you don't get it. It's called the Answers Journal. Some of you get that. Raise your hand if you get this. This is excellent. Okay, so in this particular edition, which is about 4 or 5 editions ago, Brian Thomas, who is on staff at Institute for Creation Research, wrote an article called Solid Answers to Soft Tissue. If you think that soft tissue can be preserved for 65 million years, you're highly mistaken. We have gone into the lab and done precise studies on the decay rates of some of the different kinds of soft tissue. For example, in these dinosaur bones, they inferred that collagen and hemoglobin were found. And we know from precise empirical studies the longest time period that collagen can be preserved, the rate would be a maximum of 900,000 years. That seems like a long time, but guess what? That's not even close to 65 million. How about DNA? DNA is known from particular specific studies. I have the documentation right here. He's got an entire page of references for anybody that would like to look that up. Okay, we've gone into the lab and actually done the studies. DNA cannot be preserved beyond about 650,000 years. Again, it seems like a long time. But compared to 65 million years, that's nothing. So we've got empirical evidence that says these dinosaur tissues could not be preserved by any method known for 65 million years. So now, my question is, who believes by just pure faith, because that's what they accuse us of, and who's doing the actual hard scientific studies? The empirical studies do not support that that soft tissue could exist that long. Okay, this will be available for anyone that wants to look at that after the talk. Okay, next slide. Hang in there, we're getting close. Radiocarbon is, okay, radiocarbon explained by the evolutionists. Now, radiocarbon is an accepted method for dating recent archaeological specimens. Nobody disagrees with that. But so it does have to be calibrated because there is a partial, some problems with it being 100% accurate. It's reasonably accurate. But usually we take what's called dendrochronology or tree ring dating. You take trees and look at the growth rings in the trees, and then you calibrate the radiocarbon with that. However, it is not commonly used for dating dinosaurs. Why? Because the range of the method is thought to be too short. Well, why is it thought to be too short? Because, well, we know the last dinosaur died out 65 million years ago. Therefore, the method supposedly does not work on these specimens. Now, you might think I'm being too hard on the evolutionists, but I promise you that's exactly what they say. And we're going to bring up a YouTube video to verify that that is actually the case. Okay? The other thing they only can say, because you're grasping at straws, it's like, well, what do we do? You know, we believe evolution's a fact. What do we do? This evidence is overwhelming. What do we do? Well, it must be contamination is a possibility, they would say, the evolutionists. Okay, the machines background somehow is recording or demonstrating the wrong amount of carbon, and therefore they're getting wrong ages. That's what they have to believe. Okay, now my question would be, who is it again? Who is the faith-based view, and who is doing hard empirical science? Creationists are doing hard empirical science. We're looking at the sophisticated instrument, the AMS, and saying that it's recording carbon in all these specimens, and the carbon is not a result of contamination. It comes from the specimen. Okay, next slide. Okay, objections answered. The AMS has been checked prior to testing. I mentioned it finds 0 atoms of C14 when no sample is present. That verifies that it's not contamination. It's not some kind of outside source of the carbon coming in. Workers are extremely careful when taking samples in order to prevent contamination. They do things like, the overwhelming evidence suggests the carbon-14 found in the test specimens is internal, not due to contamination. What they do is they thoroughly wash their hands. They dip the materials in acids. They put it in containers so that it's not exposed to outside carbon. They're very careful when taking samples. So contamination, as the answer, certainly can be eliminated. Next slide. Okay, the radiocarbon puzzle. I'm just about there. Even though radiocarbon dated specimens consistently show young age, as I mentioned, probably about 50,000 years before present, they do not precisely match with that biblical age. If you hadn't thought of that, you should have noticed that, well, okay, most young Earth creationists are saying the Earth is, say, 6,000 to 10,000 years old, but radiocarbon dates from all the different samples seem to consistently give an age of about 50,000. So the following list is possible answers for these discrepancies. The production and concentration of C14 in the atmosphere may have been different in the past. We have some circumstantial evidence to support that. The C14 production most likely varied in the past due to a stronger Earth's magnetic field. We can directly measure the Earth's magnetic field. We know that it's getting weaker through time. Therefore, if you go backwards in time, it was stronger, and therefore the cosmic rays would not have gotten into the atmosphere at the quantity level they do today. The carbon-14 would be different today than in the past due to the worldwide flood that would have buried large amounts of carbon in the form of fossils that we see today. Okay? There were most likely a much greater amount of C14 and lesser amount of greater amount of carbon-12 and a lesser amount of carbon-14 in the past. In conclusion, these possibilities can be supported by the fact that C14 are only precisely accurate up to 400 BC. Okay? They are accurate within reason beyond that point, but not precisely accurate. We can confirm it being precisely accurate by looking at actual artifacts, say potsherds or the pyramids and things like that, that we know from history the exact date. Beyond that, it's calibrated with dendrochronology. So what we're saying, it shows a young Earth, but it's not precisely accurate. It's reasonably accurate, but not precisely accurate. Therefore, it gives dates of about 50,000 instead of 6 to 10. These are possible reasons for that. Okay, next slide. Sorry. Okay, a prediction fulfilled. If most of the supposed fossil deposited through geological ages were actually deposited during the flood, they should have about the same age. Since they were deposited during a one-year period of time instead of millions of years of separation between these different layers of strata. This is confirmed by samples from coal beds around the U.S. ranging from Eocene all the way up to down to Pennsylvanian, deposited supposedly 40 to 320 million years old, but all give about the same age. All of these samples contain the same low-level radiocarbon levels equivalent to those supposed ages. This only makes sense if these coal beds were all formed out of a pre-flood plant material during 1 year, essentially, about 5,000 years ago. Carbon-14 dates of the same value are expected in creationist theory, contrary to expectations of conventional old Earth theory. This is what Andrew Snelling had to say. Next slide. So, I decided I'll skip past this because of the lateness of the hour, but I was going to talk a little bit about some of the other dating methods. I will just end by making a statement instead, when we look at other radiometric dating techniques, say uranium as it decays into lead, or potassium as it decays into argon, or any of the other methods, all of those methods have serious defects and problems with them, so that we cannot and do not accept these dating techniques showing an old Earth. The vast majority of geochronometers, I mean hundreds, you can find these listed, long lists, in the writings of Henry Morris, particularly his commentary on Genesis, the Genesis record at the back of the book. If you have that, I'm sure some of you have that, is an entire list, hundreds of these geochronometers. It's in all the creationist literature. You can go to Answers in Genesis, you can go to icr.org, and you will find lists of hundreds of geochronometers that show a young Earth clock. Carbon-14 can be added to that. The overwhelming evidence is that the Earth is young. And the reason that most of these scientists don't accept it is because they are committed to an old Earth, because they believe in evolution. The alleged fact of evolution stops them from even considering the idea of a young Earth. Okay, and we're going to bring up this call. It's only 6 minutes long. I'll take questions while I ask the YouTube video to be brought up. I want you to hear this conversation between a creationist and Dr. Jack Horner when asked to carbon-14 date the original T-Rex that they found. And you'll see what some of his answers are. This will confirm that evolutionists really think the way I'm saying that they do. Okay, so I'll take questions at this time. Do you have your cell phone, or if not, would someone here, you can use my phone if you like. Can someone bring up, go to YouTube for me? Are you going to do, let me open this up. Here.
Does this have
If
Wi-Fi?
this, do we have Wi-Fi here? Call to Jack Horner. Call to Jack Horner. And it's only about 6 minutes long. And you will see, because what happens is this radio DJ, who's a Christian and a creationist, asked Dr. Horner to radiocarbon date the T-Rex that they found with soft tissue in it, the first one. So the YouTube video is a little bit old, but you don't need to see it, you just need to hear it. And what Jack Horner will say is, oh, we're not going to date that because we know that the Earth is old, and that'll give dates that are young, and we don't accept those. And we're not going to give credence to you creationists, so we're just not going to date it. That's precisely what he says. If you go to that YouTube, call to Jack Horner, okay, you'll find out, and this confirms what I'm saying is accurate as far as what the evolutionists think. Okay, so maybe we'll just skip that because we don't have means to bring that up, but you can write it down and go to that.
I got a
You got-
signal, but I don't know which one of those many.
Oh, okay.